My name is Delphine. I am 71 years old, and I am dying with a secret that would make the whole state of Louisiana tremble. I was a cook. I was a slave. And on the night of December 14th, 1859, I served death on imported porcelain to 11 of the most powerful men in the South. They ate every last bite. They smiled. They toasted. And then, one by one, they went home to die, twisted in their silk sheets, drowning in their own blood, with my gumbo still warm in their bellies. My name is Delphine, and I set the finest table the Mississippi Delta ever saw. I just never told them what the secret ingredient was. Before I go any further, if you've never heard a story like mine, if something in those first words made your chest tighten and your breath catch, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Louisiana, Georgia, London, Paris, wherever you are tonight, because I am an old woman with not much time left, and these words deserve to be heard by as many souls as possible. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber helps keep stories like mine alive. Stories that were never supposed to be told, never supposed to survive. This is how history breathes. This is how the forgotten speak. And if you've ever loved someone so deeply that losing them rewired everything inside you, then stay. Because what I'm about to tell you will change the way you see justice, motherhood, and the quiet power of an invisible woman. Stay with me. The story is just beginning. Before I tell you what I put in those pots, I need you to understand something. I was not born angry. I was not born with poison on my hands or revenge in my heart. I was born soft, a mother, a woman who once believed that God watched over the innocent. But they took that from me, slowly, deliberately. The way you bleed a pig, not all at once, but enough to keep it standing while the life drains out. And if you're sitting there wondering whether a woman like me, a woman who had everything stripped away, could truly do what I'm about to describe, I want you to ask yourself something first. If they had taken your child, your baby, and sold him like a sack of corn, what would you have done? If this story is already touching your heart, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your support helps keep stories like mine alive. The Beaumont plantation sat heavy on the Louisiana earth like a wound that refused to heal. From the kitchen window, I could see the cane field stretching all the way to the tree line, a green and silver sea that swayed in the humid air, beautiful and merciless at the same time. The big house smelled of beeswax candles, bourbon, and the particular kind of rot that hides beneath expensive things. Spanish moss hung from every oak like old grief. In the mornings, the mist rose off the Mississippi so thick you could lose a man in it. And at night, the bayou spoke. Frogs, water, something older than all of us. I knew every corner of that kitchen, the cracked tile near the hearth, the iron hook where the copper pots hung, the loose floorboard beneath which I kept the only things that were truly mine. My days began before sunrise and ended long after the last candle in the big house went dark. I rose in darkness, started the fires, boiled the water, kneaded the dough. By the time the Colonel's household stirred, breakfast was already waiting. Biscuits, grits, thick-cut bacon, coffee black as the Mississippi at midnight. I cooked 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. I seasoned cast iron skillets. I rendered lard. I deboned ducks with my eyes half closed. Cooking was the one place where I had power, where my hands made something out of nothing, where my judgment was respected, even if my humanity was not. They praised my food with full mouths and empty hearts. The Colonel bragged about me to every plantation owner from Baton Rouge to Natchez. I was his prize, his treasure, his property. But underneath all of it, underneath the biscuits and the gumbo and the quiet obedience, there was a wound that never closed. August 1844. I can still hear the auctioneer's hammer. I can still feel the exact weight of my boy Toby's hand in mine. those small fingers, warm and trusting, right up until the moment they were pried away. He was 6 years old. 6. He looked back at me over his shoulder as they let him off, and his face had that expression children get when they don't yet understand that the world can be truly, completely cruel. He was waiting for me to fix it. I could not fix it. They loaded him onto a wagon headed for Alabama, and I stood in the dirt and watched until the dust swallowed him whole. That was the day I stopped being who I was and started becoming who I needed to be. The invitation arrived on the 1st of December, 1859. Colonel Beaumont summoned me to his study, a room I was only permitted to enter on my knees, scrub brush in hand. But that afternoon, he was seated behind his mahogany desk, bourbon in hand, face flushed with the particular excitement of a man who believes the world exists to serve his pleasures. He told me he was hosting a dinner, not just any dinner, 11 men, the most powerful sugar barons in the Delta, men who between them owned more than 4,000 souls. He wanted my finest work, a meal worthy of royalty, he said, a celebration of their way of life. He looked at me the way a man looks at a good horse, appraising, satisfied, utterly blind to what moves behind the eyes. I nodded. I said, "Yes, sir," and somewhere deep inside me, something that had been waiting 15 years finally went perfectly, terrifyingly still. I walked back to my kitchen and stood at the window for a long time, watching the cane fields. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had imagined this moment, or something like it, for so many years that I expected to feel wild, uncontrolled, burning. Instead, I felt cold and clear, like the bayou water in January. I knew what I was going to do. The decision did not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived like a door swinging open that had always been there, waiting. I thought of Toby. I thought of his face in that wagon. I thought of every morning I had swallowed my grief and cooked for the man who stole him from me. And I asked myself, not with anger, but with absolute calm, how many more mornings could the world afford to let these men wake up? The answer came back quiet and certain. Not many more. Not if I had anything to say about it. I had 2 weeks to prepare. I told no one. I moved through those days like a woman already freed. Lighter somehow, more deliberate. I visited the bayou edges at dawn before the field hand stirred, collecting what I needed with careful hands and older knowledge. The castor plant grew wild near the water's edge, its seeds fat and unremarkable. Hemlock stood tall in the shadow of the cypress trees, pale and patient. The oleander bushes along the garden fence bloomed pink and innocent, and in the deep shade of the oldest live oak on the property, I found what I had been waiting for, a cluster of amanita mushrooms, cream-colored and perfect, rising from the black earth like small, deadly moons. I dried them. I ground them. I stored everything in cloth pouches beneath my floorboard, next to the one remaining thing I owned from before, a small wooden button that had once been sewn onto Toby's shirt. The night before the dinner, one of the house girls, a young woman named Cora, barely 16, came to me in the kitchen. She had wide, watchful eyes and a habit of noticing things she was never supposed to notice. She stood in the doorway and looked at the rows of ingredients I had laid out on the prep table, the herbs, the dried roots, the small cloth pouches, and something shifted in her face. Not accusation, recognition. She had grown up in the bayou too. She knew plants the way I knew pots. She looked at me for a long moment, and I looked back at her, and neither of us said a single word. Then she picked up a dish towel, walked to the sink, and began washing the copper pots without being asked. That was all. But in that silence between us lived an entire conversation, one that no overseer, no master, no court of law could ever have understood. She knew, and she chose to keep washing those pots. That night I could not sleep. I lay on my cot and stared at the ceiling and let every doubt I had been holding at bay come rushing in at once. I was not a monster. I had never wanted to be. I had wanted to be a mother, Nothing more extraordinary than that. I had wanted to watch Toby grow tall, learn to fish, laugh too loud the way his father used to. I had wanted ordinary things, the kind of things that cost nothing and are given freely to some people and violently denied to others. And now here I was, about to do something that could never be undone, something that would mark my soul in ways I could not fully calculate. I pressed my hand flat against my chest and felt my own heartbeat, steady, stubborn, alive. I thought about whether God was watching, and then I thought about August 1844, and that hammer and that wagon, and my heartbeat did not waver once. The morning of December 14th arrived gray and close, the air so thick with moisture it sat on your skin like a second garment. I rose at 4 and began. The gumbo stock had been simmering since midnight. Shrimp shells, crab, the holy trinity of onion, celery, and bell pepper, a roux so dark it was almost black. Beautiful, honest. Into that beauty, carefully, methodically, I introduced what the bayou had given me. I stirred with the same steady hand that had cooked 10,000 meals in that kitchen. By mid-morning, the smells coming from the Beaumont kitchen were extraordinary, rich, complex, layered with spice and smoke and something underneath that no dinner guest would ever be able to name. 2 of the house servants passed through and complimented me. I thanked them warmly and suggested they eat from the separate pot I had prepared for the household staff. I had made sure there was a separate pot. I had always planned for a separate pot. By 4 in the afternoon, the carriages began arriving. I watched through the kitchen window as they came, one after another, rolling up the oak-lined drive, wheels crunching on the gravel. 11 men. Some I recognized. Judge Miller, who had ruled 3 times against freedom petitions brought by enslaved people in his court. Colonel Masterson, who was known across 2 parishes for the particular cruelty of his overseers. Men of standing, men of God, some of them, or so they claimed on Sunday mornings. They greeted each other with handshakes and laughter, bourbon already in hand before they reached the front steps. From my kitchen, I could hear the low rumble of their voices, the occasional burst of laughter, the self-congratulatory thunder of men who have never once doubted their own righteousness. I turned back to my stove. The pots were ready. The table was set. Everything was exactly as it needed to be. When I carried the first tureen of gumbo into that dining room, the conversation stopped for just a moment, the way it always did when the food arrived. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and then through me, the way they always did. I was furniture. I was function. Colonel Beaumont gestured proudly toward me and announced to his guests that I was the finest cook in the whole of Louisiana, perhaps in all the South. The men murmured their appreciation without looking at my face. One of them, I never learned his name, reached out and tapped the side of the tureen as I set it down, the way you tap a barrel to test its quality. I kept my expression perfectly smooth, perfectly empty. I had spent 15 years perfecting that particular mask, and it had never fit more precisely than it did at that moment, in that room, with those men lifting their spoons to their lips for the very first time. I discovered the truth about Toby on the morning of December 13th, one day before the dinner. A freedman named Solomon, who ran errands between the plantations along the river, stopped at our kitchen door the way he sometimes did, trading news for a biscuit and a cup of coffee. He spoke quietly, eyes down, the way men like him learn to speak in order to survive. He told me he had come from Alabama 2 weeks prior. He had passed through a cotton plantation in Barber County, and there, in the workers' burial ground at the edge of the field, he had seen a wooden marker, crude, barely legible, with a name carved into it by someone who had known how to make letters. Toby, 1854. He had died 6 years before that kitchen. 6 years before my preparations. 6 years before I ever had the chance to find him. My boy had been in the ground for 5 years already, and I had spent those years cooking breakfast for the man who sold him. That piece of information did not break me. I think it would have broken a different woman, a woman who still had something left to protect. But what it did was clarify everything with a terrible, crystalline precision. Every morning I had held on to the possibility of Toby, alive somewhere, older now, maybe even free one day. That possibility had been a ghost, a mercy I had granted myself without knowing it was false. Now the ghost was gone, and what remained was something harder and more honest than hope had ever been. Solomon finished his coffee and left without another word. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time watching the Mississippi move past. Slow, brown, indifferent, carrying everything south toward the sea. Then I turned back to my prep table and began finalizing the menu for the following evening with the focused calm of a woman who has nothing left to lose and one last thing left to do. I stood at that stove and I turned the choice over in my hands like a river stone, smooth on all sides, heavy in the palm. I could stop. Even then, in that final hour, I could have poured those pots down the drain, served a clean meal, walked back to my cot, and continued the slow, silent suffocation of living. Nobody would have known. Nobody would have suspected. I was invisible to them, had always been invisible, and invisibility is its own kind of safety. But then I thought about Toby's marker in that Alabama dirt. I thought about 6 years of cooking breakfast for a man who had traded my child's life for acreage. I thought about Judge Miller ruling against freedom petitions with a full stomach and a clear conscience. And I understood that stopping was also a choice, one with its own weight, its own consequence. To stop was to say that their lives were worth more than everything that had been taken, and I could not, in the end, make my hands agree to that. So I chose, and in choosing, I finally understood who I had become across all those years of grief and silence and perfect biscuits. I was not the woman they had purchased. I was not the pair of hands they had appraised at auction. I was Delphine, daughter of a woman who knew the bayou secrets, mother of a boy buried in Alabama clay, keeper of a knowledge older than their plantations and deeper than their laws. My decision was not made in rage. It was made in the same quiet, deliberate way I made everything in that kitchen, with patience, with precision, with the full understanding of what each ingredient would do once it entered the body. I had cooked for them for 15 years. I had fed their children and nursed their sick and seasoned their celebrations. On December 14th, 1859, I simply cooked one final meal, and I put my whole self into it, the way I always had. I served the bread pudding to Colonel Beaumont personally. That was important to me. I wanted to be the one to set it down in front of him, to watch his eyes light up the way they always did when he saw that particular dessert, golden and fragrant, the whiskey sauce pooling around the edges like a warm amber river. He looked up at me, truly looked at me, perhaps for the first time in 15 years, and said, "Delphine, you have outdone yourself tonight." I held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than a slave was permitted to, long enough for me to see his eyes, long enough for him to almost see mine. Then I dropped my eyes and said, "Thank you, sir," and stepped back into my shadow. Across the table, the other men were already pushing back their chairs, patting their stomachs, calling for more bourbon. They were laughing. They were satisfied. They had no idea that the meal was already inside them, already working, already keeping its own quiet appointment with every organ in their bodies. By midnight, the carriages had gone. The big house settled into silence, that particular heavy silence of a place after company leaves, full of extinguished candles and empty glasses. I washed every dish with the thoroughness of a woman erasing herself from a scene. The copper pots gleamed, the porcelain was spotless, the kitchen floor was scrubbed clean. I buried the remaining cloth pouches deep in the bayou mud before first light. In the days that followed, the news traveled up and down the river in hushed, bewildered tones. Men taken ill, convulsions reported in 3 parishes, Judge Miller found unresponsive in his study. Colonel Masterson dead before Christmas morning. The doctors called it a collective sickness, a bad batch of river shellfish perhaps, the mysterious workings of Providence. Nobody looked at the kitchen. Nobody looked at me. I was, as I had always been, completely invisible. And for the first and only time in my life, that invisibility felt like power rather than erasure. I am 71 years old and I am dying in New Orleans, in a small room that smells of dried herbs and river air, and I do not ask for absolution. The Union troops came, the emancipation came. I walked out of Beaumont Plantation through the front door on a Tuesday morning in April 1863, and I never looked back at those white columns, not once. I built a small life here, selling spices, healing fevers, teaching younger women what the bayou had taught me. I never found Toby, but I carried him every single day in the pocket just below my ribs where a mother carries the child she could not save. If you ask me whether I feel guilt, I will tell you this. I feel the weight of it, yes, but I feel the weight of that August afternoon in 1844 far heavier. Some debts are settled in courtrooms. Some are settled in silence. Mine was settled in porcelain and patience. On a December night when the Mississippi ran dark and the bayou held its breath. I go now with my secret tucked beneath my tongue, and I go without apology.